All right, welcome. Today, we are going to trace the path of one single idea on what the source material calls a wild ride. And it really is. It starts with a simple trick for reading old books and somehow ends up as a grand theory of, well, pretty much everything. Truth, meaning, reality itself. So let's just dive right in and see how this all unfolds.
So it all kicks off with this one core insight. The idea that you can actually see the structure of an argument before you've even read every single word. It's kind of like seeing the blueprint of a house before you've seen any of the furniture inside. And believe it or not, that really simple observation, that's the bedrock for everything we're about to get into.
And, that observation immediately begs the question, right? How on earth does a simple reading trick blow up into this massive theory that touches on morality, history, even the very nature of truth itself? That's the journey we're on today, and it's a pretty remarkable intellectual adventure.
Okay, let's get into our first section here, structure before data. And this is really the fundamental split we need to understand. It's kind of like learning to see the shape of the container before you even worry about what's inside. So this slide lays it out pretty clearly. On one hand, you've got the data. That's all the individual sentences, the events, basically what is said. But on the other hand, you have the constraints. These are the rules of the system, the frame that determines what can be said. And here's the really powerful part. If you get a handle on the constraints, you can pretty much predict the shape of the data without needing to know every last detail. Okay, so if this whole structure before data idea really works, you'd expect it to apply to more than just books, right? It should hold up for bigger systems like, human experience itself. So in this next bit, we're going to see how this idea of constraint holds up when you apply it to the huge domains of faith and law. And we'll use some pretty well-known stories, not for their religious meaning, but just to look at their underlying structure.
Now, this is absolutely key. We have to reframe what we mean by constraint. It's not about being held back or restricted. Think of it more as the shared boundary that actually allows meaning to exist in the first place. A good example is a contract. Its rules don't just limit you. They're what enable a complex, trust-based agreement to even happen. At the end of the day, these constraints are what preserve coherence. They're what keep the whole system together and working.
So, to make this concrete, this slide uses two major figures just as structural examples. First up, you've got Abraham. He kind of represents this pure alignment, before there was a big rule book. His faith is a type of coherence that exists without a detailed manual. And then comes Moses, who introduces the law. But here's the twist in this framework. The law isn't there to replace that faith. No, it's meant to be a codification, a structure designed specifically to protect that original alignment.
Okay, now this is where things start to get really interesting. We're heading into section 3, the Convergent Frame, and this is the point where all these different threads we've been pulling on, structure, constraint, faith, law, they're all about to just snap together around one single unifying idea.
And right here, well, the whole argument just crosses a major threshold. The scale of what we're talking about is about to blow up, because this is where everything converges. So, within this very specific structural argument, the figure of Christ is brought in, but not as a religious endpoint. Instead, it's presented as an intellectual framework. The claim being made in the source material is that this is the only frame big enough to contain all those massive tensions we've been talking about. Faith versus law, mercy versus judgment, without the whole thing just falling apart. It's presented as the ultimate convergent frame. Okay, so now the argument takes this really fascinating meta-turn. In section 4, we're shifting gears. The focus isn't on the what anymore, it's on the how. How can we actually trust this line of reasoning? How do we make sure the path that led us here is solid?
And this quote right here is the absolute key. It's basically making a case for what you could call input integrity. The idea is, if you keep the original data, the exact words, the raw conversation totally intact, then anyone should be able to follow that path and arrive at the same conclusions. Suddenly, the whole process becomes audible, it's traceable, it's something you can trust.
So when we talk about logos here, in this specific context, we're not talking about some mystical, floaty concept. No, it's a very practical, methodological principle. It literally just means preserving the source material word for word. And doing that acts as a powerful constraint that guides any future analysis and makes sure the conclusions aren't just, pulled out of thin air, they're anchored to the original data.
And all of this brings us to our final and maybe most mind-bending section. Truth embodied, not spoken.
This is where the rubber really meets the road, where we see the full implications of this entire way of thinking and how it completely turns some of our most basic ideas on their head.
Just take a look at this table. It shows you just how radical this shift in perspective is. So, judgment, it stops being about condemnation and becomes something more like exposure by contrast. A truth so bright that anything not aligned with it just becomes obvious. And salvation, it's not about escaping the world anymore, it's about finding restored coherence right here within it. An abundant life, it's got nothing to do with having more stuff. It's about wholeness, it's about alignment. And this new framing extends to everything, even ideas like sin and virtue. So sin is no longer just about breaking a rule, it's described more like falling asleep to coherence. Like you're just drifting away from that central alignment. And on the flip side, wakefulness isn't some permanent state you achieve or possess. It's this active, relational alignment with truth that you have to constantly enter into.
Whew! So let's just trace that entire wild ride one last time, from start to finish. We kicked off with that simple idea of structure. That led us to constraint, which then reframed faith as a kind of alignment. From there, we saw the idea of Christ used as the ultimate convergent frame. Then we got logos, which was the method for preserving the reasoning. And that all leads to the final state, wakefulness, which is the goal of actually living in that alignment. You see how each step just builds perfectly on the one before it? It creates this single, incredibly coherent arc.
And so all of that leaves us with one final, pretty provocative question to chew on. What if the point of all of this isn't about winning an argument, or being right, or just collecting more facts? What if real understanding, maybe even what people call salvation, is actually just about finding and then entering into an alignment with a truth that's already all around us? Something to think about.